Good morning. I am making a tool roll for the hex drivers and nut drivers that I use on the miniature engines. I'm doing that using scrap fabric from my pile, so it's a bit of a mess because I'm stitching it together out of whatever piecework fits. And this video is going to be entirely narrated because my roommate was in the kitchen while I was working, and the background noise of the regular video was completely unusable. So you can see I'm measuring the pieces out. I started by laying everything out to make a bottom piece that has room for flaps top and bottom, and then I laid out and measured the pieces to put the center piece in. This piece is going to get trimmed up and then stitched across the top of the big piece that will be the back, the outside and the flaps. And then once I have that matched up and stitched to both sides here, you can see it, I stitched it with the good sides facing together so that it can turn and then look nice when I get it unrolled. Give it a little bit of a trim, and as I went, I was binding the edges using one of that triple stitch that I have. It's a zigzag with a triple stitch. It's intended for stretch fabrics, but it holds the edges together really nicely to keep them from unraveling. So I usually put a straight stitch in, and then I run that triple stitch zigzag along the edge so that it catches the straight stitch and then holds all of the pieces together. So once I got that turned, I flattened it out here. So I pressed this, and then I continued working this out, and I'm doing this, completely by hand and figuring it out as I go. So I put the one nut hex driver in there and measured it and got out my quilting rule and pinned it and checked it, and then grabbed this other piece of pink scrap fabric and stitched a dummy pocket in it to check the dimensions that I was going to use. I eventually settled on 1.5 inches at the top side and 1/2 inch on the bottom side. So I went along and I pinned 1.5 inches and then a 1/2 inch, 1.5 inches and then a 1/2 inch across each side there. And as soon as I had it marked and pinned out at 1.5 inches and then a 1/2 inch, top and bottom there, I got out the driver and checked again that my pinning looked okay. And once I was satisfied with that, I went to stitch the bottom part of each pocket. There are 6 pockets on each side, which makes for 6 little 1/2 inch bottoms to stitch on each side. And I'm stitching these carefully one by one. It's basically 4 stitches, turn 90 degrees, 4 stitches, turn 90 degrees, 4 stitches, 90 degrees to make a little U for the bottom of each pocket. I'm stitching these in carefully and making sure that I get all the pins in the right spot. At this point, I don't want to be going back and ripping a lot of stuff out because I have so many stitches in. So instead of just starting at one side and trying to go from pin to pin and stitch this all in one shot, I'm taking my time and carefully stitching each of the That way I make sure that I'm always stitching the correct pins, and I can double check that I didn't miss a pin or stitch to the wrong one, and pull these if I make a mistake. Once I finish the 12 top and bottom stitches, as you can see, I got the 12 top and bottom stitches finished, and then I was able to turn to the back side that is all pink there, and then use those U-shaped marks that mark the bottom of each of the pockets as the beginning and end, as a better visual cue than just trying to count the pins as I stitch. And doing it this way did reinforce the bottom of the pockets, and then allowed me to be triple checking as I went along. But once I put them in, I was able to just stitch from pocket to pocket in a straight line, zigzagging back and forth to make these 6 alternating pockets, or 6 pockets on each side that alternate with each other. Once I got all these pockets finished, I set the machine aside and was able to slip all of the wrenches in after I trimmed things up. So here is a final fit, checking how many wrenches go and seeing how the flaps fit. I had a weird little pocket on the end that it turns out will take the forceps that I use with my little engines. Once I had finished that, I decided there should be a big flap for a final wrap. So I grabbed a few more pieces of scrap fabric, pressed them with a finished edge, gave one straight top stitch around, and then went back around with the triple stitch zigzag that I use, the stretch stitch that holds the edges together really nice. And then I centered that up on one end and pinned it in the middle. Once I had it pinned up there, I just threw a stitch across to hold it in place. Which I should have just straight stitched the whole flap on the whole width, but I thought that having it be separate like this so that it's only connected at the center section where the pockets are would be beneficial. If I'm doing this again, I would definitely just make the flap a single big piece across the whole thing. But again, I wasn't really working from a pattern, and it does turn out okay. Once I get this flap put in, then the tool roll works pretty well. This is the last section of binding the edges with the triple stitch stretch zigzag. And like I said, I worked to keep those two flaps separate, but really having them connected together would have been just fine. I had a couple shoestrings. I honestly don't remember where they came from, but those are what I'm going to use for ties on this tool roll. So I just measured them in half and stitched through the center of them onto the end of my flap. So I stitched those up on the middle in the end of my flap here, and that's another thing I like the triple stitch zigzag for. When you run a 0 length, then it will do a good job grabbing hold of ties and flaps and strings and stuff like this. That's all finished. So I have the little roll I made for the box end wrenches, and this roll that I made for the drivers. And I'm laying out the drivers that I have and checking them all to fit, and it worked out pretty good. The flaps on the top and bottom there, I would make a bit wider. They should fold at least halfway, if not all the way across the drivers or wrenches that you're rolling up, because that way it ends up bound together and tied up so that they won't get out the end. But as you can see, I can put both sets of, or 3 sets of drivers, and then run the wrenches down the middle and roll this up. And that's why I should have just stitched the flaps together so that they all fold at once. But when the ties are done here, it holds up pretty good and keeps everything together. And it unrolls really nicely, and that should be everything that I need tool-wise for the little engines. I did go double check the sizes of hex keys, and what I have in there is the plain head nut driver. It's just an Amazon RC engine kit that's got the 1.5 to 2.5 and 3 millimeter. And then I have a ball end set of drivers in the same sizes. And then I have the small nut drivers that are for the nuts and for the nuts on the valve head and the stops on the carburetors on those little engines.